Hey guys, welcome to the fifth video in the writing and language series. So this first one is going to be, or this video is going to be going over punctuation, which is the first video that I'm doing about grammar. So if you remember, the questions in the writing and language section are divided into two main categories, which are expression of ideas and I think grammar. I don't remember the exact name. But expressions of ideas is just like, the sentence placement that I went over last week, like sentence addition and deletion, just like all the big stuff that's not just grammar and punctuation. So yeah, so grammar is generally seen as easier than expressions of ideas, just because like the questions are a little less subjective, I guess, and there are actual specific rules. But it's still definitely worth going over stuff like punctuation because like these can be pretty tricky to like just know where types of punctuation go within the sentence. So yeah, here are the punctuation basics. It's a set of characters that appear at the end of a sentence or within the sentence to organize clauses within the subject. So when I'm talking about punctuation, I'm not really talking about the end of sentence stuff like question mark, exclamation mark, and period. Those are that's like fourth grade stuff. This is going to be more advanced, and it's pretty much all punctuation questions in the SAT are um, talking about like the organizational clauses. So a clause is a group of words that usually has a subject and it always has a verb. So there are two categories of clauses, which are independent and dependent. So an independent clause is something that can stand alone as a sentence, and a dependent clause is something that could not stand alone as a sentence. So it has to be joined to other clauses. It's worth noting that every sentence must have an independent clause to work. You can't have just two dependent clauses. So yeah, the general linkage rules for these clauses are if it's two independent clauses, it's generally a semicolon, and if it's an independent and dependent clause, then it's just a comma. So yeah, the punctuation that you really need to get familiar with for the SAT are commas, semicolons, colons, and dashes. So the most important one is probably commas for this. Yeah. Okay, so commas are the most common types of punctuation within the sentence. They serve many purposes, such as breaking up thoughts and preventing run-on sentences. So I have here the four main uses of commas, which are separating list items, separating non-essential phrases from the sentence, linking dependent and independent clauses, which I'd say are probably that's probably the most important use of a comma, and to link independent clauses with a fan voice conjunction. And then I messed up the list here. Yeah, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So if it's two independent clauses, if you don't want to join it with a semicolon, then you can do it with a comma and one of these seven conjunctions. So separating list items. Yeah, if you have a list of items, it has to be more than two, so three or more pretty much. Separate them all with commas. And for the last list item, you should have and. That's just a general rule. If it's two items, it doesn't require a comma. So separating list items, I think everyone's familiar with, so I don't really need to go over that. The next one is separating non-essential phrases or appositives from the sentence. So if you haven't learned what an appositive is, I think we learned it back in like 6th or 7th grade. It's just like a descriptive phrase, I guess. Like it'll be a noun and then comma, then the appositive to kind of like describe it, and then just another comma. So these are going to be, these commas are used in pairs. And if you read the sentence here, the national bird of the United States, that's not really, or that's not an essential phrase because the sentence could just read, the bald eagle is a good hunter. But saying the national bird of the United States, that is kind of a good descriptive phrase that's put in there to just help you understand what it is. So yeah, separating it from the rest of the sentence with two commas is one use of the comma. So linking dependent and independent clauses, this is pretty straightforward. Yeah, you just have to know which clause is which. So here it says, when the sun goes down, that's not a complete sentence. So that's the dependent clause. And then the neighborhood becomes a lot cooler. That's the independent clause. So they're linked right in the middle by that comma. And then what I said earlier about linking two independent clauses with a fan voice conjunction. There has to be a fan voice conjunction with the comma, or else you should use some other type of punctuation to separate the two clauses. And when there's a comma without a conjunction, it's called a comma splice error. So yeah, you don't need to know the name of that. So the economic damage caused by lockdown is bad. Independent clause. Um, Opening up would only make things worse. Also an independent clause. But it can be joined here by the comma because but is a conjunction here, which is one of the 7 fan voice conjunctions. So here's the sample question. While market gardens, which often supply farm stands and farmers markets, may be smaller than typical commercial farms, they tend to produce a wider variety of crops. So the main use of a comma is to separate independent and dependent clauses, as I said. If you look at this underlined portion, they all belong to the same clause. So the comma shouldn't be there to separate it or to separate two different clauses. And if you see after this, in this underlined section, there's also not a list, so there shouldn't be a comma for the purpose of creating a list. Yeah. So there's also no non-essential element that should be put in between two commas. And the correct answer here is just D. You don't need any punctuation here for it to make sense. Okay, so here are semicolons. These are more straightforward than commas, I'd say, but most people aren't really familiar with using them. I know I don't really use them in my writing a lot, but I kind of know how it's used. So there's just two main uses. It's to connect independent clauses without a fan voice conjunction. If there's a semicolon connecting two independent clauses with a fan voice conjunction, that's just that's not grammatically correct, I guess. You should either take out the fan voice conjunction or put in a comma instead of the semicolon. So this sentence here, the house next door is very loud. Independent clause. When the party ends, it will be quiet. Also an independent clause. And then just linked very easily here by the semicolon. And then the next one is to separate list items that contain commas. So here it says our trip to Canada included stops in Vancouver, British Columbia, Calgary, Alberta, and Quebec City, Quebec. So here, if you didn't have semicolons, if you just had commas, it would be just a list of 6 different things. And yeah, it just wouldn't be correct because Vancouver, British Columbia, Calgary, Alberta, the list items here already contain a comma, so it should be a semicolon instead of comma to separate them. So here's the example question. When he returned from the Galapagos Islands in 1835, Charles Darwin brought back a young tortoise named Harriet. She would live over 170 years before passing away at the Australia Zoo in 2006. So I looked at these two clauses here, and it's an independent clause at the beginning, and it also an independent clause at the end. So they shouldn't be joined here by a comma. So we're going to say that should be a semicolon. So we'll look at B because that includes a semicolon. So, a young tortoise named Harriet, who would live over 170 years before passing away at the Australia Zoo in 2006. If you were to put B in there, who would make the second clause dependent rather than independent? So, who would be correct if it was Harriet, comma, who? But here it's a semicolon, so that's not correct. C isn't correct because you need something to link the two clauses, and the correct answer is just D here. Okay, so colons. These are another fairly simple type. Oh my goodness, I spelled that wrong. So they're used to introduce additional information and explanations. So I like school for one main reason. I get to learn about history. So I get to learn about history is just my reason, I guess. Whenever you use a colon for this purpose to introduce additional information and explanations, it should always come after an independent clause. So I like school for one main reason. That's an independent clause, so a colon could work here. And then the next use of it is to start a list, just like the one used 2 lines above. So that's 3 lines above. My goodness. But here, this colon here, it introduces this list below it. So yeah, the U.S. government has three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. That's the list started by the colon. So yeah, that's how you use it. So this example question here, an average bolt of lightning produces a tremendous amount of energy, enough to power a household microwave for 85,000 minutes. So the semicolon seems to make sense, but enough to power a household microwave for 85,000 minutes is a dependent clause, so it can't be a semicolon because, as you remember, they can only be used to link two independent clauses. In this case, it should be like a comma because it's an independent clause and a dependent clause. However, enough to power a household microwave for 85,000 minutes is an explanation of the previous independent clause, where it says tremendous amount of energy. So here it should just be a colon, and C is the correct answer. So this last type of punctuation you should know is the dash. It's not to be confused with the hyphen, which is kind of shorter, but it doesn't really matter how it looks. The SAT does not focus on the hyphen, it's only the dash. So it serves pretty much the same purpose as a colon, to introduce a list or separate an independent clause from it, like an explanation or additional information. If you can see here, I used a dash within the sentence, where a colon would have done just fine, but you can just use it to serve the same purpose. And remember back when I was talking about commas, I said you could use a pair of commas to separate like unnecessary information. You can do the same thing with dashes, and it's also in a pair. So dashes also serve the same purpose as double commas or parentheses. If you read the sentence, this July 4th, the 244th in the country's history had less fireworks shows than previous ones due to social distancing measures. It would make sense if you didn't have this part within the dashes, but since it's unnecessary information, you should close it off with just two dashes. So that's pretty much it for today. I have 5 additional practice questions, and yeah, thanks for watching.